Um, so yeah, today I'm going to present on sort of an overview of extended just intonation, subtitled "Hearing the Rainbow." Sort of playing off the Skittles slogan: "If you taste the rainbow, you can also hear it," as well as seeing it, and etc. Just out of curiosity, who here has played around with just intonation, extended just intonation, anything like that before?
What's the difference between extended just intonation and just intonation?
There's really no difference. I kind of explained the term a little later, but we'll get there. Yeah, but anyone has dabbled a bit? Cool. Yeah, awesome. Great. Well, I try to build it up from the ground up, so if it sounds like a little, ooh, what's this? Like, it'll be fun. I really promise. And this is stuff that has really changed my musical thinking and has really enhanced my artistic thinking as a composer. So I hope these are tools that you can incorporate into your practice, however that looks like. And that can come out in infinite different ways, as we'll find out. Cool. So right down to business. What is just intonation? Just intonation, without the extended part. So to start with, it's a good idea to say maybe like, what's a temperament, right? We always talk about temperaments. We always talk about 12-tone equal temperament, which is what we're most used to hearing, what we're most used to writing in. It's what our notation softwares come in by default. Most DAWs, most MIDI things, we just get this into our system all the time. But have you ever really considered, like, is there anything else other than just this 12 notes per octave? And the answer is yes, so be at peace on that. But really, just to think about kind of what a temperament is before we get into what a tuning is, a temperament is like a ladder. It's like a staircase. It's a series of steps that are fixed by a single ratio. And for the purposes of equal temperament, that ratio is going to be the 12th root of 2, which gives you this funny number that is an irrational value. And so you can see a temperament is a set of pitches related by a fixed ratio, and it's usually in a temperament an irrational value. So an example, right? And that's a temperament. All the steps are equal. They're the same step. Like this is the same as, all those semitones are the same semitone. And so you have this kind of cool Escher image giving the picture of how a temperament kind of gives us the illusion of infinity, but it's actually just a stepwise cycle. A tuning, on the other hand, the steps are unequal. The steps have variations in them. It's like a staircase where every step is different. And if that's the case, most people, if a staircase is off, there's like a cool number that if a staircase is off by like 2 millimeters, you will trip. So, yeah, don't even trip. But it's like, so we're extremely sensitive, believe it or not, to extremely subtle variations in patterns. And so just intonation, or a tuning, is kind of starting to enter into that realm of allowing there to be unequal steps, different ratios, which are rational numbers, meaning that we'll explain rational and irrational a bit more in depth later, but just meaning that they have a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal, but that sounds yada yada, we'll get there. But it's more like hiking. It's more like going up a mountain, right? You have each step is kind of a different thing, and you're experiencing it. And another good word for this is a mode. So we have a scale, which is sort of a pattern with equal steps. And then we have a mode, which is a pattern with varying steps. And you can sort of think of like, oh yeah, scales like this, maybe like church mode. I don't know, don't get too deep on it. But that's more or less what we're vibing with. So then where just intonation kind of fits in. Well, actually, yeah, so tuning, we're going to be working with just intonation, which is kind of more like the open wilds of pitch space. Okay, so another thing, like is just intonation or extended just intonation is that's just spectralism, right? Because vaguely it has to do with the harmonic series, right? And that's kind of what spectralism is about. Not exactly. It can be spectralism, but it doesn't have to be. Spectralism is interested in harmonic spectra, and those can be totally harmonic, totally rationally related, or they can be all related by like pi or some like irrational number that creates all these dissonant inharmonic values. And spectralism also explores that as well. So it's kind of like a bit of a paradoxical question is like, just intonation a superset of spectralism, or is spectralism a superset of just intonation? Maybe both, maybe neither. But yeah, getting to the harmonic series, that's really for now kind of the heart and soul of just intonation. And I would say that is the just intonation. Sort of in the pure sense that the term pure intonation, which is something more evocative of like the Renaissance, exploring, these pure ratios that have resonance on earth that is in heaven. You're creating these structures that like align with the Platonic conception of mathematics in the mind, and you're hearing that in the real world, and so you're creating this bridge between the abstract and the concrete. And so this idea of just intonation is kind of bringing that into music. The terms just intonation and pure intonation might sound a little loaded initially, just because they have some things that they suggest, but really what they're just saying is that it's really just the math. Like, we're not tempering with it. And that's really what a temperament comes from. It comes from tempering with just intonation. So if we think of a tuning as kind of this large umbrella, a temperament is a way we take a few things from that tuning and we temper it to fit into a scale. Whereas a tuning, we're not going to temper it. We're going to stay and kind of leave the details in there. And so we have the harmonic series right here, which if we want a fun little exercise, maybe we can kind of hum it together. I know you have to do octave transpositions, but you get the can I hear a nice like opening of Thus Spake? And now the piano kind of gives out, because this third is not going to be just how we want it. And then we can keep going higher and higher this is beautiful. Thank you so much for singing. We can go higher and higher infinitely, really. And those notes are just going to keep getting closer and closer and closer together. It's sort of like this asymptotic thing that it'll never reach it, but it's going to keep iterating that space, smaller, that octave, really more and more notes in that octave. And so the idea of extended just intonation is that, if I'm playing something in just intonation, maybe I just have a major third and I'm kind of doing like this. And I'm not going to venture too far out. But let's say I start thinking more like Pythagoras. And so Pythagoras, the Pythagorean tuning scale is really just kind of taking a spiral of fifths and then mapping it to a line. So if I come here with C, and then I go here, I have a G, what's next? We get a C. Fifths, all fifths. We're just going fifth. D. Then what's next? What's next? What's next? E. What's next? F sharp. Yeah, what's next? C sharp. Weird C, sorry, I don't know what happened. So basically you take that and you go like, what? And then you get the fun Pythagorean scale. And actually you need to start a little lower for the F. So pretend there's another little F in there, just for the sake of this. B, and you get some funky notes in there when you do that, because you're treating fifths like thirds, and then you get that whole like classic thing like, oh, well, thirds used to be dissonant kind of talk, but we're not going there. So I guess what the extended idea here is that in extended just intonation, you let these spirals just kind of keep going. We're not going to really put the brakes on. We're not going to try to like temper it. We're not going to try to put it into a box. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. And as we continue to expand our lattice space, as
Sorry,
we'll come
what
in
you're saying
time.
in this one, it's the whole system is based on perfect fifths.
Yeah,
And tuning those perfect fifths to basically as if they were in the harmonic series,
yeah,
the simple ratio.
yeah, and you just repeat that ratio. You just keep repeating that 3/2 all the way around the spiral, and you can do that infinitely. And when you keep doing that forever, that's the extended part. Because we're not just going to stay in our little like cozy island of like, oh, this is like kind of what we're used to. Like we can kind of keep walking out into further and further out, extending the pitches. Great. So just to get a real feel of the harmonic series, here's the harmonic series. And I put the cool graphic of the sun because, like, you know, it's kind of cool to watch. Like, you hear. So right now, take a moment and really try to hear like as many different partials as you can. Just as a little useful thing. Lights are going out. That's fine. So try to cue in. You kind of get a flavor of that like harmonic series. Were there any partials that popped out to you when you were listening? Yeah.
Just the pitch.
Right. That's a little funky. That's not just in like a fourth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great one. That would be an 11/8.
Yeah.
Oh, this is kind of interesting. Is this too dark? No, we like it? Okay, great. Yeah, so that 11/8. It's a little funky. That would be called a semi-augmented fourth, but we'll get there. Any other pitches that popped out? There's a lot there.
I think more of what I didn't hear. I didn't hear a lot of the lower partial, like the middle partials.
Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And it's an interesting way to kind of experience our own listening biases. And so what that was is the Tambur Zapanic Pranath, which is like a part of the raga tradition in Hindustani music. And so you're going to have two people playing these large plucked instruments that have a pumpkin gourd resonator, and they're plucking in canon. And then there's a sweet mod that allows the string to filter through the harmonics. Like, I don't know how, like who thought of this, but somehow they figured it out. It's genius. And so spending a lot of time listening to just a drone like this and starting to feel like, get to know the harmonic series is a really great entry point into just intonation. And I highly recommend, just as a listening exercise, sitting down with something like this. I put a link to Bandcamp on it. You can listen for free. And just sitting there and kind of taking it in and seeing what pops out of the ether. And that's kind of why I did the sun graphic. Because like in just intonation, we're kind of dealing with like light, right? Like just pure light, like infinite light. And then we're gonna like kind of filter it through us and see what we hear in that and what pops out to us. And then learn how to build a vocabulary that we can then take what we're experiencing, put it on a piece of paper, and help others experience it as well. But anyways, so I put a link to that. It's really nice to listen to. Put it in the background when you're like sleeping, working, cleaning. It's awesome. Cool. So a little mathy detour, but nothing too wild. Even though that number looks a little, whoa, what's happening? It's just it's just 1099. I don't know. Right. So the difference between a rational and irrational number, and then psychoacoustic affects. But kind of, I think a really cool thing with extended just intonation is that it really lets us experience kind of the like language of numbers. It really helps us understand kind of the flavors and and just what they are in a way that we can experience a little bit more intuitively than just a symbol. And by hearing what sounds certain numbers produce, it gives us a chance to really like experience them more intuitively. Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, a tritone would be the square root of 2. If you played a perfect tritone, does that mean that there would just be no beats at all, or like how would that figure into?
That's an awesome question. And yeah, we'll explain it. There will still be beats, but there's a specific quality of the beats that we're interested in just intonation. And so to start with, yeah, if we play a tritone on the piano, we say, oh, it's dissonant, there's beats, right? But there's a specific quality to the beats that make it especially dissonant. And so when we have an irrational value giving our ratio in between pitches, so an irrational value is any number that does not, that is non-terminating or doesn't have a repeating decimal. So let's kind of break that down into what it kind of means. And so if I do a calculation, and like if you remember maybe you in math class putting in something into the calculator and it would spit out a bunch of zeros or like a bunch of like random numbers, and you're like, oh, that's a lot of decimal places, and there's no pattern to it. That's really what we're talking about. It's these numbers that the decimal places afterwards will never end. And probably the most famous example is pi, right? We celebrated Pi Day this month. I don't know. Yeah, so pi, all our roots. So our roots are what give us our temperaments. So you have the 12th root of 2. So that number, so the number in this piano that is really governing everything that's happening is that kind of wild number. The 12th root of 2 is equal to 1.05946309, blah, 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 blah. And that's only 64 decimal places, and that will go infinitely. And you could put that into a supercomputer, and it would take longer than the duration of the cosmos to calculate, because that's just how infinity rolls. There's another fun one, the 25/3, that the Stockhausen one Kurt's been talking in the class I'm in about. There's pi, just chilling. But yeah, those are the irrational numbers, and they're the ones that work in things like even mean tone, quarter comma equal to, like quarter comma temperaments. Just intonation though, oh wait, hold on, the beating thing, that's important. So Daniel, getting back to your thing, the result of that irrational value in the upper beatings is kind of this. And to sort of draw another picture is that, let's say I have a period like this, and does this feel like forward in time or this? I feel this way? Okay, yeah. So let's say we have a period, we have A and then B, right? We write left, right. Okay. So if we have a period and of A to B, and we play that tritone, so I'll just kind of do a graphical tritone, TT for tritone. If we play that, what's going to happen up in those really high partials is kind of like this. And so we're going to get like kind of a value like that in our period that is going to be non-zero, and this little wavy thing is never going to repeat, like forever, like no matter how many times you do it. And every time I play that tritone on the piano, those waves in the upper partials are never going to be the same. They're always going to be different. And the likelihood of them repeating is, that those kind of like 1 in infinity odds kind of games that you can play. And so you'll never get that to line up. But now let's say, for example, I redo this tritone, and it's not the tritone that's actually dissonant. Let's say this is now a just tritone. So let's say EJ-I. So now I'm using two just ratio between them. The tritone ratio is something like 25. I have to double check. Wait, no, it's 45 something. Whatever, it doesn't matter. So if I play that now justly, what's going to happen in the upper beatings is this. Let's see how my spatial perception is. Oh, I'll have to fudge it. But the idea is that it's going to be periodic, upstairs, so to speak. So, and that's kind of the property of rational numbers when we listen to them. Because they have a terminating or repeating decimal, which means that it's a value, or it's a repeating value that is still just what it is, it's a value. It's sort of like the computer, the like cosmic computer can get something, like it knows what you actually want, and so it can produce something. It doesn't have to keep running, calculations to keep creating all these different fluctuations. It's just, that's just sort of what it is. And because of that, the impression we get is a sound that is quote unquote smoother, but more specifically, a sound that is more resonant. And so resonance is a really big idea in extended just intonation, and it allows sound to ring naturally, sort of engaging acoustic phenomena itself, as opposed to working against it for the sake of, sort of fitting things into like 12 notes per octave. And so we get a periodic thing. And so kind of as a interesting little side note, what you have in something like, so let's just pretend now for a second this is a rhythm, right? Because we can think of pitches actually just as really fast rhythms. So if we drop this down into rhythm space, like this, just intonation is actually more like this. Yeah.
So the wavelengths are the same?
Yeah, they're periodic. So they're going to recycle,
Okay.
and so that will create more resonance. Yeah. So if we drop this down into rhythm world, we're going to get like something like 4. When we say a major third is 5/4, we're literally saying this. That's a major third, actually. So when I play a 5-tuplet and a 4/4 bar, I'm playing a major third. We don't perceive it like a major third because it's, not fast enough. But if you took that into a DAW and you sped it up, like, at least that it's doing like 16 cycles per second, then it's going to sound like a pure major third. And so, kind of the funny thing you've seen before, like kind of funny things like this. Oh, sorry, what did I do? This 4/5 is a meter, right? And these are often called irrational meters. And the reason is this: it's gone, and then we draw a bar line. So now we're kind of notating equal temperament, like a temperament, in a way. And so when you play around with these like irrational meters, another fancy word is non-dyadic, but that's a little, you kind of get the idea, is that we're chopping off that last quarter note, and that's kind of what happens in temperament. We're losing that full cycle. And so just intonation is kind of about like, hey, let's have those cycles, see what happens when we do. And so kind of the idea is that we're increasing the resolution of what we're doing. Whereas equal temperament, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's just kind of a lower resolution image of music, or like of sound. it has kind of a blur to it just because those upper beatings aren't resonating with each other. But in just intonation, those upper beatings can. And I love honky tonk piano music. Has anyone listened to honky tonk piano music? Right? Those pianos are wild. Like, I think the strings are at least like some of them almost a whole step apart, and you just get this beautiful, just wavy sound. And that's so cool too. So really this is just a different color to play with. It's not saying this is better than the other. No, it's just a different way of thinking. So another example, we can listen to it. So everyone get the sound of my voice out of your head and let's take a listen. So what did you notice?
The second one did not sound like what I'm used to.
Yeah, totally. Any other thoughts or comments, feelings? It could be like the second one was blue. I don't know.
Second one seemed to have like a upper resonance
Yeah,
that the first one doesn't.
yeah, totally.
I definitely felt the clarity of the second one a lot more. Like it didn't seem like it didn't seem like keys on a piano. It sounded like more like people singing together.
Ooh, yeah, totally.
Like there was an actual coherence to the tone.
Sure.
Wasn't there in the first one.
Yeah, and that's starting to poke into a kind of a cool idea of harmony versus timbre. But I that's a little outside of the scope for today, but that's such an awesome point to explore in just intonation. Yeah. Did anyone want another listen? Or Yeah. Yeah, so let's take a close. Yeah, so I guess for me, sort of what I experienced on the first one, like I'm getting it in this bandwidth. Like I really hear it clearly, but sort of upstairs in those higher partials, I see more of like a cloud that's a little blurry for the equal tempered one. And then in just intonation, it's like those clouds go away and you're just getting a lot more signal. If that's a fair assessment. Did anyone else want to add another thought to it? No? Cool. Yeah, you can spend so much time thinking about it. So yeah, just to say that we're getting more signal and less noise is kind of the idea. But to say that noise is also really cool. Lo-fi beats are cool. Old televisions are cool. Like, there's nothing wrong with noise. Noise is awesome. But this is just kind of a different way of thinking. So kind of to move forward, like, then what are we going to do with this just intonation thinking? And something I like to think of is using extended just intonation as a means to increase resolution. So like I said just now, basically, was if we think of 12-tone equal temperament, like 760 DPI, that like YouTube video that is trying to save your like network data or something, that's uploading like as cubes and like, it's awesome. I think it's cool. Sometimes I just like watching really low res videos. And then versus, that like 1080, 4K, 196K, like it's so clear that it's actually real and it's like quantum entangled. It's like quantum entangled with like an alternate reality, and then, I don't know, something happens. What are the artistic implications, right? Because ultimately, like this is a lot of math and sciencey stuff, but we're artists too. And not to say there's a difference between those fields, but we can start thinking about how to bring this into creativity, into artistry. And so I say, having a greater breadth of colors to choose from, And so working in JI, we can start to think more in color of how we mix pitches together instead of just presenting pitches. We can think of like our typical 7-note scale, like the C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then taking percentages between them, mixing them, adding little flavors of things, and starting to create a more rich palette, thus the hearing the full rainbow idea. And my apologies to anyone, any synesthetes in this room that do not agree with my color assignments. These aren't even mine, actually. I just randomly made this, so if these colors aren't to your liking, make your own diagrams. It's a fun exercise. So yeah, I like to think of hearing like a painter. So now instead of thinking like, okay, I have 12 colors to work from and I have to paint the Mona Lisa, now you can sort of think like, I can mix any color I want and I can paint anything I want. I have all the power in the world. So, and so like for example, like maybe I want a minor third, but I want a really minor third. I want something that's like, sad. So I might swap out the 7th from the harmonic series, right? So we know the like minor third, but it's a septimal minor third, so it's going to be even lower than our usual idea of the minor third. So I write that in my music, like, oh, it's so sad now. It's a septimal minor third. It's using higher limit partials, yeah. But all that to say that when we start to face these infinities, it's, this means we can actually explore infinite pitches. How do we navigate infinities? This could be a source of existential dread, the scream, Omega, George Cantor, if you like that stuff. The 4D scene from Interstellar, Yeah, I really had fun shaping down the exclamation points as a font. Is something I really enjoy doing. Sorry to point that out. So yeah, this is kind of an issue that you've kind of let go of everything. You've let go of your theory, your harmony, everything you've thought of before, and now you're just out there, kind of in the void, and you're like, okay, now what? And that can be a stage in working in extended just intonation that is a little freaky, because then all of a sudden you have to kind of rebuild your own thinking. And so it's fun, but also a bit daunting. And so moving forward, we're going to think about some tools that'll be really helpful. And our biggest friend is going to be symmetry. And so for a lot of composers, they organize just pitches in these things called lattices. And it's just sort of a way to graphically interpret the relationships between pitches, to think of them as geometrical shapes, to think of them in some sort of array that can express their meaning without having to keep track of infinite different numbers. Instead, when we understand the symmetry of something, we don't need to know all the information at the same time. We can just understand it in the principle of it and then be able to move more fluidly through it. And so it's sort of also how you solve a Rubik's Cube, right? You have some ideas and some principles, but you're dealing with this trillion solution problem. And that's kind of what we're dealing with in just intonation. So kind of as a fun exercise now, which let me just see does anyone have the, let me see how we're doing. Oh, great. We can fly through this. Yeah, so as a fun exercise now, let's sort of think about building a lattice space. So let's just say that C is our 1/1. So that's our fundamental for now. So let's just talk through the harmonic series. So if C is our fundamental, what is the next partial? Shout it out.
G.
No, C is fundamental.
Oh, C. Oh, sorry, C.
Yeah. I know, it's kind of a trick question, right? You're like, G, oh no. No, yeah, so we have C. And what interval did we just create? An octave.
Yeah.
And so what if I say C is another octave? Is that a different note? If I go up another octave, do I get a different note? yes and no, but
Yes.
let's go real like, you know, Stinky Schoenberg moment and be like it's the same note, it's set here, whatever. So you know, do I get a totally different note? Or do I get something that I perceive as the same and different, right? An octave. So and then if I go another octave, I get another C. And I could keep going infinitely, and I just still get C. And so this right now is our 0-dimensional point floating in the center of our little void that we just entered into. And that is our 2-limit interval, limit. And this word limit pops up a lot in extended just intonation. It sounds kind of calculus-y, but it's really not. It just means that 2 is the only number present in the prime factorization of the ratios present, which is a jargony way to say that you can't make any numbers. The only number you can use is 2 to make other numbers. So really what we just did was 2 to the n, right? So if we have 2, and then we have 4, which is, you know, 2 to the 2, and then we have 8, 2 to the 3, 16 to the 4, etc. We get all these octaves. And because they're octave and they're not creating any other interval, we're just going to call that a 0-dimensional point. And so we have our bum. So we have our C. What's the next note in the harmonic series? G. So that's a different note. So what we're going to need to do is launch out into that space and create a line. And now we have a G, right? And so that is going to be our 3/2. And believe it or not, this line can extend infinitely in both directions. So I can get a D 9/8 and an A plus, which I'll explain that in a minute, which is our 27/16, and then it goes the other way, F 4/3, and then we get B flat, what's the ratio for this again, 9/16. Okay, and these are all fifths. And so we've just created our 3-limit line. So we need a line to represent these two intervals working together. And now I can have a G that's like 1,000 octaves higher, but I can still make that G out of these two values. And so let's add another, so we have, we just got to the G, what's the next note? We get another C, right? So that's our fourth harmonic. So that's, you know, our 2 to the 1, 2 to the 2. Then, after that C, what do we get? E. So that's our fifth harmonic. And if you notice the pattern, we're actually just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And every time we get a new prime, we're essentially getting to add a new dimension in the lattice space. And so now I'm going to shoot out into 2D space. And I'm going to get that E that we just talked about, 5/4. And that can go on infinitely in both directions. We have our A flat 8/5 over there. And so 5, 6, what note would our 6 be? So we just went from E, what's the next one? G. We already have G. We don't need another dimension. What comes next after the G? B flat.
Flat B flat.
Yeah, it's the little funky one. Right. And so because we've added another interval, we need another dimension. So we get that B flat 7. And this also goes in both directions. So this can go infinitely, 7's going up and down. These are different kinds. So 7, and then what do we get again? After that, we get 8, which is a C, back to C. So there's a really cool pattern in like the harmonic series that every odd number is a new partial, and every even partial is an even, every even partial has already occurred, so it's a repetition. So 1 is odd, that's C, we've never had C before. And then 2 is even, we've had C, we just had C. Then 3 is odd, and we add a new note, G. 4 is even, oh, it's another C, we've had C before. 5 is odd, we added E, oh, that's a new one. 6 is even, oh, we had a G before, yeah, okay, that makes sense. 7 is odd, we add a new pitch. 8 is even, yeah, it's another C. So it has this oscillating pattern going back between odd and even, kind of creating new partials every time. And whenever those numbers are prime, so you might notice these are all prime numbers, that's when we really get a new interval in just intonation. And prime numbers are really the essence of extended just intonation. And so we're interested in using primes that are higher than 5 and 3. Most of the music that we're used to hearing really only uses 5 and 3. And then the 7 we kind of fudge. That's why I don't know if that's why, but a theory why we have a quote unquote dominant chord that wants to resolve is because we're using these intervals to try to represent this interval. And when these two do it, it sounds pretty harsh. It wants to move somewhere. But if we have a natural seventh, it has no sense of wanting to move. It's pretty stable. So there's sort of interesting, philosophical questions of function that come up when you start adding in more partials again. So we can keep going with this. So we have 9, 9, 10, and then 11, which was that great interval that Oliver heard. And so we have a 3-dimensional space here. So we have an 11 here though now. So what do you think we have to do next?
13.
No. So we're trying to add the 11 into the lattice space that we're building. So it's what's the next step? We have 3 dimensions now. What's the next step?
Fourth dimension.
Yes. It's just right. No, it's just fun, right? To think fourth dimensionally, Marty.
So it's an infinite amount of dimensions.
Yeah,
It can keep going.
As long as there's infinite primes, and yeah.
Which there is.
There is, probably,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, as long, yeah. So yeah, And so, basically, now you have to hop over here into hyperspace, and you have your 11/8, which was the note that Oliver picked out in the tamburas. It was over here in 4D space. Whoa, right? And then, so this also exists infinitely the other way. So we have 16/11 over here, and another 4D space, but going in the negative direction, right? So let's add our last prime for the day, which is 13. So what do we do now? Yeah, so you kind of get the idea. Now if we take this space and we kind of go let's say we have, it's now over here you have this 5D space that is a copy of the 11D space over here. Oops, I'm annihilating chalk. Yeah, so let's say you have your 13/8 here, and you can just keep counting primes, and this lattice space just keeps getting, having more and more dimensions to it, which is kind of crazy. But if you can think of it that way, what you're doing is kind of dropping down the CPU you need to think about individual pitches, but instead hear them as symmetrical patterns that you can sort of internalize a bit. And the more you listen and experience and, kind of can think geometrically, if I want a major triad, I literally draw a shape between these 3 notes and now I have a triad. And it's isomorphic, which means that I can transpose this anywhere in this funny 5D space, and it's still going to be the same shape. That's going to equal major triad. So you can start thinking of these shapes moving through these spaces, preserving their qualities, and then also transforming them into other shapes. which is pretty fun. Just as a little random side note, just to explain what's happening when I go into the negative direction. So if I have like a 3 to the m thing, if the exponent is positive, then I'm in something called like these are overtones or otonal space, which is a Harry Parch term. But I can also make that negative. And so that's kind of what's happening here. So if this is like, let's say this C is actually just 3 to the 0, which is 1. And then we get 3 to the negative 1, which we look here, we have 4 over 3, right? And the negative 1 puts it in the inverse, so it puts it in the denominator. And then this is 3 to the negative 2. This is 3 to the positive 2, 3 to the positive 3, 3 to the 4. And what we find is that these exponents themselves are actually coordinate pairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I have a 5D space, I can represent any interval in that extended just-intonation infinite lattice space as some coordinate, five coordinate point, which is kind of cool. And if you're interested in like doing weird things in Max and SP, you can just like have numbers like this and have a bunch of random numbers pass through prime power multiplication and spit out, you know, endless random pitches that are all in just intonation, and it sounds like whoa. But it's sort of useful to know. Okay, so you kind of get the idea that we just sort of built our, so we built the octave, that was our 0-dimensional point, then the fifth was our 1-dimensional line, our 5 limit was our 2-dimensional plane, our 3D solid for our 7s, our 4D hypercube for our 11s, and our tridecimal neutral 6th, which is the 5-dimensional 5 cell. And all these intervals have a different flavor to them. Don't take my word for it. Go back, and I'll give you a ton of resources after this, which I'll share with everyone, to how you can like download stuff and start playing around and hearing partials and kind of getting to know them and building an emotional connection with them. Okay, great. So yeah, that's a 5 cell. So yeah, we're in this like wild kind of infinite thing, but we kind of know what's going on. So it's not as existential, hopefully, as it was when we first started. But something that's really cool is that, like how Olivia picked up on really quick, was if there are an infinite number of primes, which there probably are, then in theory we can have an infinitely dimensional lattice space where not a single pitch ever repeats, so uniqueness, every single pitch is unique, and every new dimension is a new flavor of interval. And the only thing that really limits our interval experience is our perception itself. Because the higher you get in a harmonic series, how we talked about earlier, those intervals get so close together that we can barely hear it. So melodically, the cutoff of perception is pretty, like you can't go too low. So like, for example, D, 9 over 8, which is that interval over here, is 1.54 cents lower than a 509 limit partial. And you know, a cent is already a 1/100th of a semitone. And so 1.54 of a 1/100th of a semitone is pretty small for a hearing. If you can do that on your oral skills exam, like don't even like walk out with your DMA right now, I don't know. Okay, great. Unless Dr. Yelbert rejects it. No. Yeah, so just to give a little example of that, melodically, we probably can't do much with that, but if we do it harmonically, we get this. And then we've added it. Right. So you just heard a 509th interval, which we just perceive as a beating. But that beating was a periodic beating. It was basically a tempo, which the tempo is about 113 BPM. if I tapped it accurately earlier today. But yeah, that's another way to think about just intonation, as using these sort of acoustic phenomena of these really tiny intervals that we can't perceive to create effects like that. Yeah, Oliver.
Isn't that like just the interruption of the beating? Isn't that how theremins work? It's like there are tones that are played that are so ridiculously high above our own perception, and then you get in the way of it with your hand, and it creates another
Ooh.
tone.
Yeah, I actually don't know that
Oh,
off the top of my, but that's awesome. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. That makes sense, maybe, I think. It feels right.
yeah.
Just dip your hand in the. Okay, great. So, kind of moving forward is like, how do we represent this, right? We're dealing with a lot of stuff, and at the end of the day, we have to hand this over to a performer or to someone, even if it's just ourselves. Thankfully, a composer named Ben Johnston, who worked with Harry Partch, really had a lot of insight on how to represent extended just intonation extremely rigorously, as well as extremely musically. And so we're not just dealing with like numbers and math that feel like kind of alienating when you're thinking as when you just want to perform, but we can have the union of this like rigorous theory along with musicality, artistry. And so it's very beautiful. And so coming up with the system, you see these funny accidentals over here: plus, minus, sharp, flat, 7, upside down 7, up, down. And those are really designed to help maintain the symmetry of the lattice space. And Johnston has these amazing accidental rules, which I'll upload into the EJI starter pack folder, which I'll share with everyone after this, which explains kind of the principle of how they accumulate. And so, for example, right off the bat, you notice I put a plus here. And the reason for that plus was that if I didn't, this A would actually be the A that's over here, which is a major third with F, right? Because this is our major thirds going on this direction, forming this plane. But I want the A plus, which is this A, actually from the Pythagorean scale, the 27/16. And so I add the plus, which if you look up there, the plus is equal to 81/80, which is the interval of the syntonic comma, which allows that fifth to correct itself to be a fifth with D, whereas without it, it would be a major third with F. And so they're two different notes. They deviate by only 21.5 cents approximately, but the notice acoustically is extremely present, just as adding that 509 limit interval created a totally different pitch than what we heard. The slightest change in the comma creates a totally different sense of tuning. So it's an extremely subtle way of exploring pitches. But yeah, I'll play this example, and you can sort of see them in action. So that was an example from Ben Johnson's 10th String Quartet, 4th movement, with this beautiful rendition of the Danny Boy melody. And really just in this little example, you can see almost a full display of all the accidentals we talked about. So you might not see it, but right there in the second measure, second violin part, that F sharp and that little 13 is actually a 13 limit F interval. So if you go over here in the diagram and you see 13 is 65/64, so what that means is that very talented violinist is going like this, is going very quickly in their head 4/3 times 65/64. And if anyone has a calculator or flash math in their head, whatever that equals to is going to be that note, that F13 note. And that little 13 is going to add just a little funk to that chord that is sort of in between major and minor. That's sort of how 13 limit intervals are perceived. They're a neutral sixth. That is kind of the like feel of them. But if we just listen to that again, see if you can tune in to how subtle those inner voices are. Right? Yeah. So I've given a link to Kyle Gann's website that explains the notation in much more depth. Go check that out if you take interest in it. But another great resource is Zen Harmonic Wiki. It's an excellent sort of crowd-sourced resource for extended just intonation stuff. Some other cool examples, something to play with. There's a lot of technology in just intonation. One of which is the comma pump, which this comma pump is written by this like 15th century Italian theorist. I always like mix it up in my head with like Bernoulli, but that's the person that did like actual fluid dynamics. But it starts with a B. It's on Wikipedia. You can. But here's an example of a comma pump. So what do you kind of notice that's happening now that we've kind of talked about all these different tools? I can just talk too. It's getting sharper, right? It's accumulating pluses, these little pluses. It's the same pluses. Oh, I erased it. It's the same. It's that plus, it's that 81 over 80, but as it goes through this cycle, it keeps getting sharper and sharper and sharper. Another example in just intonation would be the circlififths would actually become the spiralififths, because if you go through one sequence of the circlififths, sort of like how Pythagoras experienced, you would come back to the same note, but it would be sharper. Or it would be flatter, depending on which direction you're going. And so these sorts of things happen in just intonation all the time. And for a long time, they were sort of seen as a problem. And that's why that's why, instrument builders explored temperaments, because this was the thing that they were trying to figure out. Like, we just can't keep going infinitely up and down a lattice space. What are we going to do? We have to put it in this timeline, this universe, right? But now with computers and different things and just honestly the way we can hear and perform music, we can really explore kind of those spirals. And so here's a great example of that in action, very virtuosically by composer Toby Twining. Yeah, so that gives you a little flavor of it in kind of the real world in action. And if anyone's sung in a choir before, what's the number one thing choir directors always say at the end of the piece? Like, we drifted, right? Like, don't drift. But Toby is interested in the drift. Let the drift happen. The drift is actually mathematical. And so that's what Toby is exploring here. These intervals are acquiring the 7 limit intervals, like as it's going through this. And those were all stacks of septimal thirds. So if you do a spiral, but with that minor third from the harmonic series, you're going to get that super just chord that we just heard at the end. Super cool. Let's see. Another thing, like, so kind of from a practical perspective, is like, how do you work with performers on this kind of stuff? And that's really about having a conversation with them. Learn it the best you can, but then in practice, sort of work with what they're willing to explore with you. And so an example of an experience I had was that when I wrote this piece, Rainbow Diamond, with alarmable sound, I was talking to the conductor of the ensemble about, what kind of just intonation things are you comfortable with, what can I explore? And I wanted to use the Johnston notation. I wanted to have, all the pluses and minuses and like super, like, oh, it looks so cool, look how mathematical, look how smart. Oh. But then the conductor just replies with one line, that wouldn't be necessary, just use quarter tones and put the partial number above it. And that was it. So that's what I did. So you kind of get the flavor, but all they needed to know was the partial flavor that they wanted. So if you look up there, you see very tiny 7s and 13, and then the rest is just quarter tones. So if the notation system scares you or you just feel like this is just too much, you can just use a quarter tone and then just say, this is kind of where it's going, and then just put the partial number. And it's very easy. And then it allows the performer to then use their own intuition as to how that partial sounds to represent it, as opposed to just trying to match a value. And so I feel like they did a pretty awesome job with that method. So there's a lot of ways to go about it. Don't be afraid to just make up your own system. A lot of JI is about building your own adventure, especially Harry Parch, we did the Room Full of Teeth thing a while back. I had some like JI Light in there, and they totally nailed it. And another kind of fun thing to explore in that, I explored like the idea of incorporating wolf intervals, which is an idea from temperament, is when you hit a fifth that's like funky, which in the Renaissance they said would howl like a wolf. And you'd get that in like these clavichords. You'd be going through the fifths, and then you get an A flat major, and it'd be like, what? But so in exploring that, I was able to kind of emulate a train whistle and kind of in this way, because train whistles have these little detuned things going on in there. You can also just use MIDI, and I'll send some resources that you can actually, there's an awesome calculator that you can calculate whatever note you want in this space using the Johnson accidentals, and then just copy and paste the pitch bend into Sibelius. And then, create your like infinite MIDI Nancaro plus like craziness. But this is a little track just to give it's very slow. Oh, and loud. So yeah, finding the way you work with it. It can be working with performers. It could be working with technology. Just for sake of time, we'll keep kind of going. So yeah, kind of to conclude with all of this, extended just intonation in some sense is not even music. Really, it's just a pattern. It's really just a system of symmetry. And you can apply that system to anything. You can apply it to architecture, gardening, mathematics, whatever you want. We can interpret it as music. And so when you compose with it, I guess it's just more about thinking about kind of a relationship between things, and you'll find that that relationship extends out into a lot of other fields, which is super cool about it. Then you're just kind of dealing with like the language of the numbers and kind of how they speak and how they sound. And so really it's, I kind of jokingly call it like the string theory of music, but in some sense it is. It's just you're dealing with this infinite possibility, and then you're just taking a little snapshot of it and filtering that through you and picking out what you like and then painting something with it. And so it's a really fun way to expand your artistic thinking, as well as your harmonic palette, and as well as just the colors that you can use in your composition. So yeah, think about what you can do with it.